More political shenanigans, a namesake avenged, and a great disaster visits some of the Greek cities on Sicily. Join me for episode 5 in my mini-series on ancient Sicily, all on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome. My name's Neil, and in this episode I'm picking up with what happened at Sicily after the defeat of the Athenian expedition. In the last episode, I ran the rule over the failed attempt by Athens to bring Syracuse to heel. It was a bit of a roller coaster. If you thought the Greek cities on the island could have a nice cup of tea and a bit of a rest, think again. There was a whole heap of trouble coming, and that saying about how history repeats itself was to prove horribly true. Before I go further, a big thank you for some of the reviews and comments which have been rolling in. One in particular is worth a mention because it included a great question about why the focus in the episodes were weighted more to the Greeks than the Phoenicians and the Sicilians, and I want to quickly answer that. In short, it's to do with the source material that we have. The Phoenicians and Sicilians don't have much in the way of a crafted narrative in the way the Greeks do through the accounts of, say, Herodotus, Thucydides, and later Diodorus Siculus. It would be a dream to have something about the Phoenicians and native Sicilians written by one of them and covering accounts of the events of their history. We don't have that. What we are left with are objects, inscriptions, and buildings which require interpretation. It's still amazing to have these, but a cup saved from a tomb can only tell us so much. For example, it won't recall a speech that was made, provide an account of a battle, or simply describe a particular incident which the Greek sources just didn't bother with. In the first 2 episodes, I did my best to offer some insight into the non-Greeks through what we have found at sites across Sicily. But, simply put, that lack of a textual source is the issue here. I hope that helps answer the question, and thanks again for the nice comment that went with it. If you want to leave feedback, please do, and I can neatly segue into the standard appeal for reviews and ratings, which you can leave on Spotify or Apple or whichever platform you use to listen. Remember, on Spotify, you can leave comments for individual episodes. Aside from all of that, and if you just want to get in touch with me, you can do so via my website, ancientblogger.com. where there will be notes for this episode, including, as you probably already know, transcriptions, maps, that kind of a thing. You can also find the Ancient History Hound subreddit on, Reddit, and Twitter or X with the handle @HoundAncient. There's also me on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and X as Ancient Blogger. It's all ancient history, by the way, or perhaps the occasional picture of my dog. If you're really old school, you can email me on ancientblogger@hotmail.com. Okay then, that's that done. Let's get to Sicily. In 413 BC, Syracuse had delivered a humiliating defeat to Athens. The Sicilian Expedition had been a wild ride, with the likely outcomes changing more than once. But at the end, it was Athens which had lost lots of men, resources, and its reputation. Things had actually got worse than that though, because it had indirectly led to Athens breaking the Peace of Nicias, and so Sparta was now free to attack Athens directly. The Sicilian expedition had occurred because in 416 BC, Egesta or Segesta, a non-Greek city, had appealed to Athens for support against the Greek city of Selinus, which itself was backed by Syracuse. Though Egesta was non-Greek, the central issue here was cities on Sicily inviting overseas elements to help with their internal power struggles. This had been done earlier at Himera in 480 BC, which I'll be mentioning later, and it was such a concern that in 424 BC there had actually been a conference of the Greek cities on the island at Gela, in which they all agreed to not bring in overseas interests. Whilst this was a sensible idea, the Greeks missed a trick. I say this because it wasn't so much the action of a Greek city, or in the case of Egesta, a non-Greek city, reaching across the waters for help, which was the issue or the problem. It was much more about ensuring that no city felt the need to do so. The old saying about prevention being much better than a cure certainly comes to mind. I'm not going to say much more than that about it right now, but the Greeks could have saved themselves a lot, and as you'll hear, a lot of bother if they had taken that opportunity to redress that problem. But hindsight is a gift, I suppose. After the defeat of the Athenians, the historian Diodorus Siculus described a debate as to what Syracuse should do with the Athenian captives and their commanders. Hermocrates, who you might remember from the previous episode, called for clemency. He seemed to want the soldiers released in part along with the generals, but two men were vehemently against this. Gylippus had been the Spartan general who'd been sent to help Syracuse and worked wonders in its defence. His reasons were more of the pragmatic type. Sparta was now at war with Athens, so if he could avoid all of those soldiers returning, all the better. The other person against it was a new character, Diocles. Little is known about Diocles, save for his dedication to reforming Syracuse to make it a more democratic place. His reforms included having experts draft laws, and the use of lots to select officials. As such, he was widely admired, and one account of his death sums up his dedication to the laws that he had created. One day, Diocles heard a commotion in the marketplace and headed there to see what was going on. However, he was wearing a sword, and one of the laws that he'd brought in forbade this. In fact, if you caught carrying a sword in the marketplace, the punishment was death. When this was pointed out by an onlooker with the comment that Diocles was not following his own laws, he killed himself on the spot. Now, this may be true, or it might just be a tale to underscore the virtuous nature of Diocles, but it tells us something about at least how he was perceived. The assembly at Syracuse was swung by the arguments of Gylippus and Diocles, and so the Athenian generals met their respective ends, and the Athenian soldiers were enslaved, though there is an anecdote that some were able to buy their freedom if they could quote lines from Euripides. As for Hermocrates, he was promoted to general and sent with some ships to aid Sparta against Athens. Though this sounds like something to celebrate, it may have been the opposite, and perhaps the work of Diocles, who emerges as Hermocrates' political rival. That's because by giving him this honour, Hermocrates was now away from Syracuse. Added to this was that any general was accountable for their successes and their failures. Hermocrates couldn't cash in on his achievements in helping defend Syracuse against the Athenians. These couldn't now be used to cover him if he failed in his new role. Outside of Syracuse, a big question now hung over Egesta. What would it do next? Athens, its would-be protector, had failed. Worse still, Syracuse was triumphant, and as a result Silenus could act against it without any fear. In 411 BC, Egesta had therefore found itself in the same situation it had been back in 416 BC, alone and needing some backing against Silenus and therefore Syracuse. In 416 BC, it had been Athens which it had sent an embassy to, but this time it looked far closer to home. Egesta, as you may remember from previous episodes, sat in the west of Sicily. This had traditionally been an area controlled by Phoenicians, primarily through Motia, which was the first colony on Sicily that was made by the Phoenicians. But there were also the other Phoenician colonies of Panormus, which is modern-day Palermo, and Salunto. As I covered in episode 2, Tyrants and Tragedy, the Phoenician colony of Carthage captured Motia in the mid-6th century BC. It was now Carthage that controlled that part of the island. The Carthaginian corner had largely stayed silent in the affairs of the Greeks. The one notable exception was in 480 BC, where it had supplied a force to one Greek tyrant who faced off against another Greek tyrant. This had been the famous Battle of Himera, where the Carthaginian force was crushed. As a result, it signed a peace treaty with the Greek tyrant Gelon. Egesta now sent ambassadors directly to Carthage requesting support. This met with strong approval from one individual there. Hannibal Mago was apparently the grandson of Hamilcar, the Carthaginian general who had fallen at Himera in 480 BC. As the movie tagline goes, this time it was personal. But why would Carthage consider such an offer? What might their motives be? Without a Carthaginian source, we're left to speculate, but there are some good reasons as to why Carthage agreed to lend its support to Egesta. The main being that Egesta was in the region Carthage controlled, that western corner of Sicily. If it fell to Selinus or Syracuse or some Greek power bloc, then it would cause tension. The history of the Greek cities on the island had been couched in expansionism, both at the expense of the native Sicilians and other Greek cities. It would be naive for Carthage to think that Egesta could fall and it not lead to something bigger further down the line. Scaffolding this point is that to not do anything might be seen as a large indication of weakness. What Carthage perhaps feared is what if the Greeks stopped squabbling, formed an alliance, and decided to push them out of Sicily. Carthage now had the funds to support Egesta, and it had a general like Hannibal who was pulling at the lead to do so. An important final point was what Egesta offered, which was effectively the city itself, in return for protection. Hannibal immediately set about sourcing a mercenary army with soldiers recruited from Africa and Iberia. With this force, he landed at Motia and marched to Selinus, and in 409 BC, he laid siege to it. Selinus sent for help, and Syracuse assembled a force with the cities of Gela and Acragas waiting so they could join them as one single force. Diodorus Siculus noted that this took some time, and perhaps this wasn't an issue as the Greeks thought that they had time on their side to respond. This, in part, was due to the nature of sieges in the ancient Greek world. These were often drawn-out affairs where one side encircled a city and waited it out. A common tactic would be for the besiegers to appeal to a disgruntled faction inside the city, promising them the power that they were seeking once the city was taken. If this worked, then, lo and behold, a gate would spring open at an opportune moment, or soldiers let in for a sneak attack, or a revolt incited which would agree to a surrender. When Selinus fell, it didn't do so to any treachery. It fell because men stormed the walls and managed to take the city far quicker than might be expected, according to Diodorus, in a matter of days. The following description by Diodorus is full of despair, but also what might be familiar tropes about Carthage by the time that he was writing. Diodorus Siculus may have been a Greek born in Sicily in the 1st century BC, but he knew his Roman audience would lap up accounts of Carthaginians being suitably barbaric and savage. As such, temples were sacked and disrespected. There was mass slaughter of some 16,000 inhabitants, and the dead were mutilated. Now, of course, this could have been true, but even if not, it would have been a good idea to include. After all, it's not as if Carthage was going to sue. According to Diodorus, Selinus had stood for 242 years before Hannibal took the city and pulled down its walls, leaving it as a broken husk. The effect of this should not be underestimated. True, the tyrant Hieron had reshaped Catana and temporarily named it Etna, but an entire city destroyed, its inhabitants enslaved or slaughtered, this was something the Greeks hadn't experienced on Sicily, and worse was to come. Hannibal Mago was not satiated, and his next move took him north to Himera to settle the old score I mentioned earlier. So began the fight for Himera. At Selinus, the tactic had been to try and repel the siege from the walls, but here the Greeks decided upon a different strategy. A force from Syracuse led by Diocles combined with defenders from Himera and took the fight to the Carthaginians outside the city. This took the Carthaginians by surprise and drove them back. However, Hannibal soon regrouped and led a countercharge, which at first checked the Greek momentum and was then victorious. The defeated Greek force made it back to the city where they waited for the siege to begin. However, what was to cause the greatest damage wasn't a siege engine or Carthaginians scrabbling up and over the walls. It was a rumour which spread and caused widespread panic. The rumour was quite simple. Hannibal wasn't intending to lay siege to the city. This was a distraction, and whilst the Syracusan force was embroiled at Himera, a small group of elite soldiers were on board ships and heading for Syracuse, which lay undefended. Like any good rumour, it was just plausible enough to be believed, and the Greeks responded to it as if it were real. Himera was to be abandoned in order that the Syracusan force could return. Diocles commandeered 25 triremes to help with the evacuation. These would shuttle back to pick up the population and move them to a safe distance. In the meantime, a force would be left to defend the walls as best it could and wait to be picked up. Perhaps those last defenders realised what was going to happen, but perhaps some furtively scanned the horizon for the tops of masts or a prow, but these never came in time. Soon Hannibal took the city of Himera, and so began its destruction. Cue the expected stories of brutality. This even extended to 3,000 prisoners being executed by Hannibal's men at the spot that his grandfather had fallen. In a short space of time, 2 important Greek cities on Sicily were practically gone. By 409 BC, the fortunes of the Greeks on Sicily and the Carthaginians were in stark contrast. Syracuse had gone from the zenith of defeating Athens outside its walls, and more impressively, in its great harbour, to the nadir of retreat and watching an enemy destroy Greek cities which were in a sense under its watch. Just to give some context, you might think this meant all of Greece was at war with Carthage, but this wasn't so. Carthage continued to trade with other Greeks. Pottery from Athens was still being imported by Carthage and traded whilst all of this was going on, and it's another reminder of how complex the nature of Greek city-state politics could be. After completing his victory at Himera, Hannibal dispersed his troops and returned to Carthage a hero, his ships sitting low in the water with all of those spoils of war from those 2 rich Greek cities. His successful campaign had left more than gaps in the landscape where cities once stood. It had reset the power dynamic on the island, and this itself would have internal consequences at Syracuse, as you'll hear. If you scrape the barrel, you could find some comfort for the Greeks on Sicily. Hannibal hadn't pressed his forces more, so they at least had that. Perhaps that was it, a stern lesson for the Greek cities who'd be left to lick their wounds for a few generations. They were also not entirely out of the fight, and there was at least one individual who was looking to show Carthage that the Greeks still had something left in them. When Hermocrates set off as a general to support the Spartans with those ships, he'd ended up quite a distance from Sicily. The modern-day Sea of Marmara sits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It was here in 410 BC that a Spartan force which included Hermocrates and his fleet was defeated by Athens. After the defeat, word came from Syracuse that the generals, Hermocrates included, had been exiled, and yes, this was probably the work of Diocles. Xenophon, a contemporary source, painted a scene of those serving under Hermocrates begging him to stay and not leave. But of course, Hermocrates wouldn't hear of it. This was the law after all, and Hermocrates would never break the law. When Hermocrates returned to Sicily, he couldn't enter Syracuse due to his status as an exile, but he could do something. Making his way to the ruins at Selinus, he partially rebuilt the fortifications there and used it as a base. With around 6,000 troops, he started to raid the Carthaginian western area of Sicily. His next target wasn't Carthaginian, it was his political enemies back in Syracuse. Hermocrates travelled to Himera, where he gathered the bones of those Greeks who had fallen and had them transported to Syracuse for burial by a detachment of his men. This might be considered an act of pious altruism. However, it was much more a political act with an underlying message. When the carts arrived in Syracuse, the effect was to undermine those who'd been in charge at Himera and who hadn't afforded the slaughtered Greeks the correct funerary rites. In a sense, this seems almost obvious. After all, the whole force had been soundly beaten, so there just wasn't the opportunity to do this. However, affording the fallen the necessary rites was always a sensitive subject in ancient Greece. During the Peloponnesian War, Athens had lost a naval battle at Argonusae, and a storm had prevented recovery of the bodies. Despite this, the generals in charge were charged and executed for this when they returned. Diocles and the others who'd overseen the defeat were now under high scrutiny, and in 408 BC, Diocles was exiled, and from this point we don't hear much about him, save that anecdote about his death I mentioned earlier. If this was true, then presumably he was recalled, though a politician with strong democratic leanings being recalled at a later date seems unlikely for reasons which will become obvious as I continue with the episode. Hermocrates had settled the score against his political rival, as it's difficult to consider what he'd just done with the remains unless it was to undermine and sow discontent with Diocles. With that said, he was still in exile, and perhaps the plan had been to have his enemies forced out of Syracuse and his exile to be annulled. But that second part didn't happen. It's also possible, especially given what happened next, that Hermocrates had little intention to return to the political system which had seen him exiled. It seems more likely that he wanted to sidestep it completely. Hermocrates coordinated what seems to have been a power grab, and specifically a very tyrant-shaped power grab. Communicating with his supporters in Syracuse, he arranged to arrive outside a city gate at night with a small number of soldiers. Presumably, he'd then enter the city and before any resistance could be mustered, seize power. Of course, he might also plead his case and ask to be recalled from exile in person, but really, that doesn't sound at all plausible. It seems the tyrant option was much more what he was trying to do. As to his intentions, we'll actually never know because word got out, and both Hermocrates and his supporters were ambushed by a group of Syracusans. Hermocrates was killed, and his supporters met the same fate or were arrested and then themselves exiled. That is, with one notable exception, and I'll come to him shortly. For Syracuse and the other Greek cities, the threat of a returning Carthaginian force needed to be mitigated. Ambassadors were sent to Carthage requesting that Carthage ceased hostilities, though perhaps request might be too strong a word here. At best, Syracuse could hope that Carthage might find options elsewhere. The response from Carthage was ambiguous and served only to confirm what Syracuse must have suspected, namely that Carthage still wanted more. We might also figure in the actions of Hermocrates, who had rallied a reasonable-sized force, partially resettled Selinus, and launched attacks on Carthaginian territories. With this in mind, could Carthage trust that the Greeks wouldn't just use peace to regroup and then attack them once the situation was more favourable to them? Perhaps Hermocrates' actions had actually made the situation worse for Syracuse. The hero of Sicily, Hannibal Mago, was chosen to lead an army, this time of huge proportions. Diodorus cited two sources he used, Ephorus and Timaeus, who were roughly contemporary with the period. Ephorus had the army at an eye-watering 300,000, with Timaeus providing a smaller 120,000. It's a good example of how even contemporary sources might differ. But the reality was that a much smaller-sized army was more likely. An army half the size of Timaeus' 120,000 would require huge logistical support. With that said, Carthage did have a base of operations on Sicily, but even so, 60,000 would have been a very large army for that period. At this point, I just want to make a dig at Thucydides in relation to something that I picked up on the previous episode. Thucydides had this whole thing that Athens was trying to conquer Sicily through the Sicilian Expedition. But when Athens launched the Sicilian Expedition, the military force numbered just over 5,000. I know, I should just let it go, but as I said in the previous episode, it just really irks me. In 406 BC, Hannibal landed with his forces in western Sicily. Syracuse had been amassing a response and had sent out emissaries to the Greek cities on Sicily to form a unified bloc. Acrogas on the south coast was the obvious target for Carthage, and so they began to bring in everything from around this city inside it, so to deprive Carthage of any resources. According to Diodorus, the city was fabulously wealthy. Its citizens lived well, as made clear with the decree that guards who spent the night at their posts were only allowed 2 pillows and a mattress. Tough times indeed. The army of Hannibal soon arrived nearby and offered Acrogas the option of neutrality, but these terms weren't accepted. As was custom, the besiegers cleared buildings and anything near to the walls so they could build up a mound or ramp to them. However, in doing so, the soldiers of Carthage demolished a very large building. Well, actually a tomb, the tomb of Theron. You might remember Theron from episode 2. He was a tyrant at Acrogas and as the tomb was being broken down, lightning struck it. Soothsayers in the Carthaginian camp had earlier warned against damaging the tomb, and though a coincidence, what happened next must have vindicated them in the eyes of those Carthaginian troops who began to suffer. Earlier, I spoke of how a force besieging a city might operate, and how the Carthaginians seemed to have developed a way of storming the city walls. This may have been Diodorus retrospectively applying what he understood by siege warfare of his day and imagining that's how Carthage did it. But there was something which anyone in a siege in the 5th century BC and the centuries later would have known about: disease. Large concentrations of people living in relatively unsanitary conditions, often the case with an army at siege, could easily be ravaged by disease. Think of the arrows of Apollo, which blighted the Greek camp early on in the Iliad. Think of the bouts of illness suffered by the Athenian forces who laid siege to Syracuse, which I mentioned in the previous episode. This great fear was visited upon the Carthaginian camp, and amongst the victims was one Hannibal Mago. Diodorus recounted how the Carthaginians looked to bring favour from the gods back with sacrifices, and this even included that of a young boy. The new Carthaginian general was called Himilco, and now he faced a different threat, albeit not directly. A force from Syracuse numbering some 30,000 men arrived and immediately engaged with the Carthaginian army, who were driven back. The Syracusans, under a general called Daphnaeus, didn't pursue them, and the rationale given was that Daphnaeus didn't want to run into the main Carthaginian force. This presumably means that the force besieging Acragas was an advanced detachment of it. But Daphnaeus wasn't being passive. He made for the Carthaginian camp nearby and laid siege to it, cutting off any supply routes. This caused a near mutiny of the mercenaries in the camp. But Himilcar, the general in the camp, stalled this with a bribe and promised that everything would be okay in a few days. The promise wasn't empty. It was based on the fact that he knew a number of supply ships were sailing towards Acragas, and these weren't under escort. When they were intercepted and seized by the Carthaginians, the situation was reversed. Now Carthage had the supplies it needed, whilst the Greeks besieging them knew that they'd lost their logistical support. Added to this was that the Greek force sent was only a temporary one, and now the situation looked hopeless. Acragas didn't have much in the way of resources and supplies stored, and so it couldn't resist any sort of siege over a period of time. Those supplies that they'd been expected had been crucial. If they had arrived, presumably they would have bought the city the time it needed. There was now only one choice. As at Himera, there would be another evacuation and another empty city. The people gathered up what they could carry and at night made for Gela by foot. When the Carthaginians entered Acragas, it was largely a ghost town. As you might expect, Diodorus has accounts of the Carthaginians acting in a barbarous and savage way, pulling people from their sanctuary in the temples and showing no mercy to those who'd remained. A huge amount of loot was taken, including the brazen bull, which I mentioned in episode 2. Back at Syracuse, an assembly of the people was called, and there were raised voices and fingers being pointed at all angles. Blame was thrown around, firstly at the generals, then the leaders at Acragas, and even Syracuse. After all, it had been Syracuse who'd largely called the shots, and under them, the Greeks had now lost 3 substantial cities. In amongst all of the name-calling and shouting, a man stepped forward. His name was Dionysus. He was from a middling family and was a clerk, a perfectly respectable job. Up until this point, he'd been largely anonymous, though there was that incident where he'd managed to escape when Hermocrates and his supporters had been set upon. Yes, this was the individual who'd slipped away. Dionysus advocated that the generals be punished. Not through the standard process, let's do it right now. This kind of firebrand rhetoric drew support, and when he was threatened by the officials with a fine if he spoke any more, a wealthy citizen called Philistus stepped forward and said he'd happily pay any fines issued as long as Dionysus just kept talking. Dionysus became the man of the moment, highly popular, a real crowd stirrer, and you probably know where this is heading. He pushed through a law to recall those who'd been exiled, as Syracuse needed all it could muster. Some of those exiles would presumably have been those fellow supporters of Hermocrates, but even if not, they now returned and would be obliged to him. Did this include Diocles? It's not that clear, but perhaps unlikely, as I mentioned earlier. In a short space of time, Dionysus became the dominant politician at Syracuse, and he was soon to extend his popularity elsewhere. Gela, to the west, would presumably be the next city along the southern coast to fall. Syracuse had deployed a Spartan there called Dexippus with the job of defending it. Now one of the generals, Dionysus took a force there to bolster its defences and immediately played politics once more. He got involved in a standoff between some rich nobles and the poor. Finding in favour of the poor, he had the nobles executed and confiscated what they owned. This he used to pay off the soldiery there and those he'd brought along. Almost overnight, Gela was celebrating his name. When he returned to Syracuse, he did so with a revelation. Himilco, the Carthaginian general, had sent an envoy to him. The premise of the envoy was to discuss captives taken by Carthage, but secretly it was about him walking away. The envoy told Dionysus that Himilco had secretly bought off the other generals and brought them over to the side of Carthage. He knew that Dionysus wouldn't join him, presumably because Dionysus was just so upstanding a fellow who would never sell his city out. Instead, Himilco requested that Dionysus just step aside. Dionysus was so outraged by this obviously not fabricated in any way event that he offered to step down as general because he could not work alongside these traitors. The next day, an assembly was called to discuss this, and Dionysus came armed with other charges against his fellow generals. In a moment of pure coincidence, and yes, that is sarcasm, one voice shouted out that it would be better if there was, just one general with supreme power, and it really should be Dionysus. If you listened to my separate episode on tyrants I released recently, and even if you didn't, you'll know where this is headed, mainly because I just said the word tyrant. But what was missing was a bodyguard, which a tyrant usually required. Copying a trick by Pisistratus, the tyrant of Athens, Dionysus feigned an attempt made on his life. It was now crucial that he had a bodyguard to keep him safe from those who were set against him, and this he duly received. In 404 BC, Syracuse therefore had its first tyrant since the removal of Thrasybulus back in the 460s. The combination of a tyranny at Syracuse and a Carthaginian force on the island weren't exactly new elements, but there was something unique about it all. In particular, this Carthaginian force was threatening Syracuse directly. It was rumbling towards Syracuse, and Dionysus needed to act fast. In the next episode, I'll pick up on what happened next. As I mentioned earlier, if you can leave a review or a rating, please do. It really helps. But as ever, and more importantly, keep safe and stay well.